The letter hit Earl Dutton like a bucket of cold water on a January morning. Past due. 90 days. The bank needed $4,200 by the end of the month, or the tractor was gone. Earl read it twice. Then he sat down in the dirt behind the barn and didn't get up for a long time. This is a work of fiction set during the 1970s through the 1990s. While characters and events are created for storytelling, they reflect documented farming experiences and historical economic conditions of that era. The tractor in question was a 1958 Farmall 350. It had 44 horsepower, a 2-speed PTO, and a body that looked like it had been in 3 wars and lost every one of them. Earl had bought it for $400 at an auction outside Carrington, Indiana, back in the spring of 1974. It burned a little oil. The seat was held together with baling twine. But it ran. He was 26 years old then. His hands were already rough from 4 years of working other men's land. He had $618 in a savings account and a rented 80 acres of flat Indiana ground that grew corn like it had something to prove. He had one trait that his mother called stubborn and his father called necessary. Once Earl Dutton decided something, he didn't quit. The man who lived on the 400-acre spread to the east was named Douglas Pruitt. Doug wasn't a bad man exactly. He just had a habit of letting his money do his talking. His father had left him the land, clean and paid off, plus a John Deere 4430 that still smelled like the dealership. That tractor had 125 horsepower, a fully enclosed cab with air conditioning, and a price tag of $28,500 new in 1973. The first time Doug saw Earl's Farmall 350 chugging up the fence row, he laughed. "That thing gonna make it to the field?" Doug called from his cab window. Earl looked up. "She made it yesterday. Reckon she will today." Doug shook his head. $400 of trouble is what that is. He wasn't entirely wrong. The trouble with Earl's situation in 1974 was that corn was selling for $3.02 a bushel, which sounded decent until you ran the numbers. Earl was farming 80 rented acres. His landlord took a third of everything off the top. His input costs, seed, fertilizer, fuel, chemicals, ran about $38 per acre that year. After the split and the expenses, a good 140-bushel corn year left Earl with maybe $4,100. He had to stretch that across seed for next year, equipment repairs, his rent payment, groceries, and the note on the Farmall. There was no room for anything to go wrong. In August of 1974, something went wrong. A hailstorm came through on a Tuesday evening. Earl was eating supper when the sky turned green. He ran to the porch and watched it happen. The sound was like gravel thrown against a tin roof. It lasted 11 minutes. He timed it. When it was over, his corn looked like it had been beaten with a board. Stalks bent sideways, ears stripped half off. He walked the field at dusk. The mud pulled at his boots with every step. He stopped in the middle of a row and looked north and south. He figured he'd lost maybe 40% of his yield. That was the difference between surviving and not surviving. He thought, "I can sell the Farmall and work for wages." He stood there long enough to let that thought pass through him completely. Then he turned around and walked back to the barn. He called his cousin Marvin in Kokomo. Marvin ran a grain elevator and sometimes knew where part-time work could be found. "Can you unload trucks on weekends?" Marvin asked. "As many as you need," Earl said. So that fall, Earl worked the elevator on Saturdays and Sundays at $2.80 an hour, then drove home and ran his own harvest through the week with the Farmall and a borrowed 2-row picker. He made the loan payment in November. Barely. He was $140 to the good after paying every bill he owed. He sat at the kitchen table that night and wrote that number down on a piece of paper. $140. He put it in the coffee can above the refrigerator, where he kept his thinking money. Doug Pruitt, meanwhile, had bought another 80 acres that fall from a neighbor who retired. He was farming 480 acres now. He hired 2 part-time workers. One afternoon, Doug stopped his pickup at the road where Earl was pulling a disc with the Farmall. "You get through that hail okay?" Doug asked. "Well enough," Earl said. "Heard you were working the elevator weekends. Rough go." Earl just nodded. There wasn't much to add to that. 3 years passed. By the spring of 1977, Earl had saved $2,300 and rented an additional 40 acres from an older widow named Pauline Fair, who wanted someone she trusted to work her ground. He now had 120 acres. He'd rebuilt the carburetor on the Farmall himself, using a rebuild kit that cost $14.50 from the IH dealer in town. He'd replaced the magneto the summer before for $67. The tractor ran smoother now than it had when he bought it. Corn prices were better. They'd climbed to $2.60 in '76 after the '73 boom had settled, but input costs were rising too. Earl kept a ledger. Every dollar that came in got a job before it touched his hand. In the fall of 1978, Earl did something that surprised everyone who knew him. He bought land. Not much. 40 acres that had been in the Hensley family for 2 generations. Old Carl Hensley had no kids, bad knees, and a desire to move to Arizona before one more Indiana winter found him. The land was priced at $680 per acre. Earl needed $27,200. He put $6,800 down, every dollar in his coffee can and savings combined, and borrowed the rest on a 20-year note at 8.5% interest from the Farmers State Bank. His monthly payment was $189. The first morning he owned that ground, Earl drove the Farmall out to the far corner at sunrise. The air smelled like dew and black dirt. The engine knocked softly in the cold. He sat there a while. Just sat. Doug Pruitt heard about the purchase from the county clerk's office. 40 acres? That Farmall thing won't last long enough to pay off 40 acres, he told his wife at supper. His wife, Ruth, didn't say anything. She'd met Earl once at the county fair. She thought he had kind eyes. Then came 1980. The farm economy had been booming since the early 1970s, and a lot of farmers had borrowed heavily on high land prices. Interest rates were climbing. The Federal Reserve was fighting inflation hard. By 1981, the prime rate hit 21.5%. That wasn't a typo, 21.5%. Farmers who had borrowed at variable rates felt it immediately. Land values that had been $1,500 an acre in 1979 started sliding back down. Earl's fixed-rate note at 8.5% held. That one decision, taking a fixed rate instead of a variable, would matter more than almost anything else he ever did. But the crisis still found him. In 1982, corn fell to $2.28 a bushel. His input costs had risen 30% over the last 4 years. He was farming 160 acres now, his own 40, Pauline's 40, and 80 more he rented from the church. He ran the numbers in February and came up $1,800 short of what he needed to cover all his obligations. He didn't sleep well that winter. He lay in bed counting things, bushels, dollars, acres. Then, in March, the Farmall's rear axle seal failed. The repair was $340 plus parts. Earl had $280 liquid. He drove to the IH dealer in town. The service manager was a man named Dale Pickett, who'd been there 20 years. "I can do it for $280 if you haul it in yourself and pick it up yourself," Dale said. "I'll order the seal today." "She'll make it to your lot," Earl said. The Farmall limped in on a Thursday. Earl had his tractor back in 11 days, 5 days before spring planting started. He made it work. Doug Pruitt was not making it work. In 1979, Doug had borrowed $180,000 to buy another 120 acres at $1,500 an acre. The loan was variable rate. When interest rates spiked, his annual interest payment alone jumped from $12,600 to nearly $26,000. His land was now appraised at $900 an acre. On paper, he'd lost $72,000 in value in 2 years. Doug was a proud man. He kept a straight face at the co-op and the feed store. But Ruth knew. She'd seen the letters from the bank. 2 more years passed. By the spring of 1984, Earl had paid down $3,100 on his land note and kept every acre he started with. He'd added one piece of equipment, a used 1969 IH 144 row planter bought for $520 at a farm sale in Cass County. His operation was still small by any measure, but it was his. Clean and his. Then Pauline Fair called him on a cold Tuesday in February. "Earl, I want you to have first look at my land," she said. "I'm going to sell." He gripped the phone tighter. "What are you looking for, Pauline?" 700 an acre. My son thinks I should get 8, but you've kept the ground well, and I'd rather it stay with someone who'll care for it. 40 acres at $700 an acre. $28,000. Earl had $4,400 in the bank. He thanked Pauline and told her he'd call her back in 3 days. He drove to Farmers State Bank the next morning, talked to a loan officer named Gary Henning for 45 minutes. Gary looked at Earl's ledger, his tax returns, his payment history on the first note. "You've never missed a payment," Gary said, almost like a question. "Never had a reason to," Earl said. The loan was approved at 10.25% fixed for 15 years. Earl put $4,400 down and financed the rest. He now owned 80 acres free and clear. Well, not free and clear, but his. That April, he planted his own ground from one end to the other with the Farmall and the 4-row planter. The smell of turned earth came up around him in waves. The engine pulled steady. He could feel every rock through the seat. He went row by row until the sun set behind him. Time moved the way it does on a farm, by seasons, not years. By 1987, Earl was farming 240 acres total. He'd rented 80 more from 2 different landlords who'd heard his name around the county. He still ran the Farmall 350 for light work, pulling the disc, mowing fence rows, spot work around the buildings. He'd bought a 1975 IH 1066 for field work in 1985. That tractor had 100 horsepower and cost him $7,200 used. It pulled a 4-bottom plow without complaint. The summer of 1988 brought the worst drought Indiana had seen in decades. Rain quit in late June and didn't come back until August. Corn was silking in 100-degree heat. Earl walked his fields every morning. He watched the leaves curl. He watched the ears set short and thin. By July 15th, he knew it was going to be a disaster. At harvest, he pulled 74 bushels an acre on his best ground. His worst field came in at 51. He'd budgeted for 140. He'd gotten half that. He sat down at the kitchen table that October night with his ledger and a pot of coffee. He was short $6,200 on his operating loan. The bank could technically call it. They had every right to. Earl drove to the bank before Gary Henning even knew the drought numbers were in. He walked in with his ledger, his crop insurance payout of $4,100, and a plan. "I'm short," he told Gary. "Here's where I am, here's what I have, and here's how I make it up over the next 18 months. Gary looked it over for 10 minutes. "Earl, most guys don't come in until we call them," Gary said. "Figured it's better to see you than have you see me," Earl said. They restructured the operating note, stretched the shortage over 2 years at no penalty. Earl shook Gary's hand and drove home. He thought about the $140 in the coffee can 14 years ago. He thought about how far that number had come. Doug Pruitt lost 120 acres in 1989. The bank had worked with him through 86 and 87, but the drought was the final straw. His variable rate debt had never fully recovered. His land had appreciated somewhat, but not enough to cover what he owed. The bank took back the 120 acres he'd bought in 1979. They got $1,100 an acre at the forced sale. Doug's note had been for $1,500. He was left with 360 acres, a lot of pride, and a grudge he couldn't quite name. At the co-op one afternoon, Doug saw Earl loading a 50-pound bag of seed corn into his truck. "Hell of a year," Doug said. "Yeah," Earl said. "Dry." Doug nodded slowly. Something had shifted in his voice. The easy laugh was gone. The early 1990s were a steadier time. Corn settled in around $2.35 to $2.65 a bushel. Not exciting, but workable if you kept your costs tight. Earl paid off his second land note in the fall of 1991, 7 months ahead of schedule. He now owned 80 acres free and clear, no debt on them at all. He celebrated by buying a used grain bin, a 15,000-bushel Brock steel bin, for $3,200 delivered. He put it up with his neighbor Harold over one long September weekend. Now he could store his own grain and sell it in February when prices ticked up, instead of dumping it at harvest when every farmer in Indiana was doing the same thing. In the winter of 1992, he did it again. He sold stored corn in February at $2.71 a bushel. His harvest time price in October had been $2.18. On 18,000 bushels, that difference added up to $9,540. It was the single biggest payday he'd ever had. He sat with it a minute. Then he started thinking about where the next 40 acres might come from. The phone rang on a cold Thursday morning in late March of 1993. Earl was eating oatmeal and reading the farm section of the paper. "Earl, it's Doug Pruitt." Earl set down his spoon. "Morning, Doug. I want to talk to you about something, in person if that's all right." Doug came over that afternoon in his truck. He looked older than Earl remembered. The big laugh was completely gone now. They sat at Earl's kitchen table. Ruth had given Doug a reason to come, she'd said. Ruth was sick. They needed cash. Doug had 360 acres. He wanted to sell 80 of them, the piece that bordered Earl's east fence. He was asking $1,200 an acre. "I want you to have it," Doug said, "before I put it on the open market." Earl looked at the table for a moment. "What's the timeline?" 30 days. Maybe 60 if you need it. $96,000. Earl had $24,000 in savings. Gary Henning was still at Farmers State Bank. He looked at Doug. He thought about the tractor comment 20 years ago. He didn't bring it up. It wasn't the time, and it wasn't the point. "I'll talk to the bank," Earl said. "I'll call you by Monday." Gary approved it. 25% down, 15-year note at 7.8% fixed. Earl signed the papers on a Tuesday in May 1993. He now controlled 360 acres, 160 owned, 200 rented, and had the Farmall 350, the IH 1066, a grain truck, 2 bins, and a 4-row planter. Not bad for a man who'd started with $618 and a beat-up red tractor. 3 years after that, in the spring of 1996, Doug Pruitt called again. Ruth had passed the previous winter after 2 hard years of illness. Doug had sold another 80 acres to cover medical costs. He was down to 200 acres now, and he was tired. "Earl, I want to sell the rest," Doug said on the phone. His voice was flat and quiet. All the edges were worn off it. "All of it?" Earl asked. "All of it. I can't keep going alone, and there's no one else I trust to take care of the ground." They met the next morning. Earl brought his ledger. Doug brought nothing but his keys. 200 acres at $1,400 per acre. $280,000. Earl thought about the tractor sitting in his shed. The Farmall 350. Still ran. He'd kept it running for 22 years. It had cost him $400 and maybe $1,800 in parts over that time. He thought about the letter from the bank in 1974. Past due. 90 days. He thought about his own 40 acres, paid off in 1991. Then the second 40, Pauline's ground. He thought about a February morning selling corn at $2.71 when everyone else had already sold. "I can do it," Earl said. Gary Henning had retired 2 years earlier. The new loan officer was a woman named Sandra Foss, who was 34 years old and had grown up on a farm herself. She looked at Earl's 20 years of tax returns, his payment history, his land holdings. "Mr. Dutton," she said, "you've never had a late payment in 20 years. Never had a reason to, Earl said. The loan was approved, 15 years fixed rate, 7.25%. Earl Dutton was now the owner of 360 acres of Indiana farmland. The closing happened on a Wednesday. Earl drove home afterward and parked in the barn lot. The Farmall sat in the corner of the machine shed, where it always sat, its red paint faded to something between orange and rust. The baling twine on the seat had been replaced twice over the years. The engine still turned over clean. Earl leaned against the doorframe and looked at it for a while. He was 48 years old. He had crow's feet and rough hands and a bad knee from a fall off a grain truck in 1985. He owned 360 acres. He had $31,000 in the bank. He owed a lot of money and would for years to come. That was the truth of farming. You were always playing the long game against the land and the weather and the market. But he was still here. He walked over to the Farmall and put his hand on the hood. The metal was cold from the March air. There was a faint smell of old oil and dust. He thought about Doug's voice on the phone, flat and tired. He thought about his own voice in 1974, sitting in the dirt behind the barn with that bank letter. There wasn't much distance between those two men, really. One of them had been lucky with interest rates and careful with debt and stubborn about not quitting. The other had been unlucky with rates and confident at the wrong time. Earl didn't feel superior. He felt lucky and tired. And something that wasn't quite pride, more like relief. That evening, he started the Farmall and drove it out to the far corner of what used to be Doug Pruitt's land. The sun was going down behind the tree line to the west. The sky was that pale winter orange that lasts about 10 minutes before it goes grey. He sat on the tractor with the engine idling. The field stretched out ahead of him, flat, dark, freshly tiled the previous fall. 360 acres. Not a sound except the old engine and the wind moving through the stubble. Earl sat there until the light was gone. Then he turned the Farmall around and headed home.